very pleased today to have with us, as mentioned, Professor Huda Mahmoudi, joining us from the United States, Washington, D.C., and Dr. Janet Khan from Australia in Brisbane, to discuss their latest book, A World Without War, Abdu'l-Bahá and the Discourse for Global Peace. This fascinating book, published at the current centenary of the revelation of Abdul-Baha's tablets to the Hague, sets out the Baha'i perspective on peace. It also examines Abdul-Baha's contributions to discourses through the talks he delivered during his travels in the West, his association with peace groups and leaders of thought, as well as the community building activities promoted by the Tablets of Divine Plan. By way of introductions, while certainly none is needed for these two extraordinary scholars, it is a pleasure to introduce first Professor Huda Mahmoudi, who holds the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, College Park, since 2012. She previously served as coordinator of the research department at the Baha'i World Center and as dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern Illinois University. Most recently, in fact, this previous year in 2019, she's the co-editor of 2 volumes, one, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Human Dignity and Human Rights, and second, a volume on Children and Globalization, Multidisciplinary Perspectives on that. And Dr. Janet Khan has also served as a member of the research department at the Baha'i World Center. Dr. Khan has held academic positions at the University of Maryland, University of Michigan and the University of Queensland in Brisbane. Her many contributions to Baha'i thought and scholarship include books ranging from Prophet's Daughter, The Life and Legacy of Bahiya Khanum, to Heritage of Light, The Spiritual Destiny of America, to Call to Apostleship, Reflections on the Tablets of the Divine Plan, and a volume on Advancement of Women, a Baha'i Perspective, which she co-authored with her late husband, Dr. Peter Khan. Welcome again to our esteemed authors. So without further ado, let's begin with a question posed to both of you from the outset on your new book, A World Without War. How did you decide to write this book together? What was that experience like? How did you decide on this particular topic?
I think I'll take that question first, and then Janet can, of course, come in when she'd like. First of all, I'd really like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, who is at the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, for organizing the technology side of this, and of course, Mr. Vafa Valapour for moderating today's session. It's really a pleasure for Janet and I to be a part of this session where we can talk about this book that we have written and how excited we were while we were writing it. How did we decide to write this book? You know, at the Baha'i Chair, when I came to the Baha'i Chair, it was in 2012. And one of the concerns that I had, and in fact in discussion with some of my colleagues and friends, was that the vision of the goal of the Baha'i Chair, which is really to discuss the Baha'i vision for peace, that is the goal of the program. How will we remove all the barriers that prevent society from being a peaceful place? And so, as Mr. Valapour read the 5 themes of structural racism, human nature, governance, women and peace, etc., we had to create this vision, firstly, and we did, and it's on our website. But secondly, there was a desire to write something that portrays this amazing vision for global peace, because it's a complex vision. It's an all-inclusive vision. It includes the entire planet, every person, all the institutions and structures, because it's based on, first and foremost, the principle that, you know, humanity and the world has reached a point today where it is one. It is all interconnected. It is all interrelated. And therefore, if something goes wrong in one part, something goes wrong in the rest of the world, you know? So it's that interconnectivity that is extremely important to talk about. So, you know, years passed and the opportunity didn't seem quite right. But then when we saw in 2018 that the 100th anniversary of two letters that Abdul-Baha, the son of the founder of the Baha'i religion, had sent to this committee at the Hague in the Netherlands, which we'll get into later. When we realized that this June, just this past month, was the 100th anniversary, Janet and I decided that we really need to begin to see if we can write a book that will be ready by the time of the anniversary. So that really in 2018 was when we started to search the library sources, look at all the other sources that, including primary sources, secondary sources that we could explore and see how not only did these letters get delivered to the Hague, but then also the way that Abdul-Baha, this person who lived in the East but decided to travel to the West in 1912, how he approached the topic of peace in his talks, in his conversations with individuals, and in the things that he wrote. So really that's when this book began to take shape, and now it is in its final form. Janet?
I think Hoda and I enjoy working with each other. We had years of joint service in the research department. And so this was an opportunity to collaborate on a project that was very meaningful. And as Hoda mentioned, the initial interest was when we discovered that 2008 and 20 would mark the centenary of the writing of these letters to the Hague. But for me, there was another element, and that was 2018 was a time when the world was preoccupied with reflection and discussion on what had led up to the First World War and the effects that this war had had on the world at that time and has continued to have. So I got curious about digging into that. And the reason for digging into it was that the events that were happening in the period leading up to the First World War coincided with the time when Abdul-Baha was actively engaged in promoting an all-inclusive vision about peace. So it was this like question of darkness and light, and so that was interesting to explore.
Dr. Khan, if we can continue on this, as Professor Mahmoudi also mentioned, this vision of Abdul-Baha and his articulation in the discourses of the times, through first the Secret of Divine Civilization and his treatise on politics, to the activities in his talks throughout the West, particularly in Lake Mohawk. How did the unfolding vision for and discourses of peace take place as Abdul-Baha defined them?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's fascinating to try and trace some of the unfoldment of the discourse. The period leading up to the First World War, historians have referred to the fact that every facet of international politics from the last decade of the 19th century through to the beginning of the war was shaped by imperialism. And Europe's main powers, as you know, at that time were divided into two armed camps. And they were divided by a series of alliances. And these alliances, although they were intended to be defensive, they were two-sided. On the one hand, they were defensive, but on the other hand, should there be an outbreak of violence between one of the members of one alliance and one of the other, then all of the nations, all of the countries that were associated with one or the other had to come to the aid of the one that was attacked. So imperialism was shaping a lot of the thinking of political thinking at the time, and led to rivalries between the great powers. This led to an increase in militarism, growth in the size of armies, and a pervasive feeling of distrust between the nations of the world. Associated with this was also nationalism. And each of the countries that the empires had colonies, and it was a time of ferment. At the same time, there were organizations and elements of civil society that were engaged in a wide range of activities promoting peace. And the women of the world were really leading the way in many of these organizations. They were voicing opposition to militarism, rapid rise in the arms race, and raising questions about the institution of war itself. Now, the discourse, the peace discourse, didn't have support from governments. At least, yes, well, it really didn't have much support from government, nor did it have a very, it didn't have just one comprehensive focus, but there were groups who were involved in the peace movement because they were against conscription, others because they were against armaments, others because they saw it as the way of promoting women's suffrage and the like. And in addition to that, there was disagreement about the methods that should be introduced to bring about peace. With that as a background, I think it's fascinating to think about Abdul-Bahá's approach. He clearly was an astute observer of the issues of the day. He knew what was going on. He understood these forces at work in society. But he didn't set out to provide a detailed political or social commentary on a period. But I think as I reflect on his life and the kinds of activities that he was engaged in relation to peace, it seemed like that what he was doing, instead of dealing with specific conflicts or providing a detailed commentary, he offered an inclusive vision of global peace. He was concerned about universal peace. And the strategy that he adopted was to enlarge the context of the discussion. And I think he did two things. He embedded the discussion of peace within a broad historical and spiritual context. He reflected on the historic contribution of religion to the unfoldment of civilization. And then I think the second element was that in discussing specific contemporary issues, he offered comprehensive insights about Baha'u'llah's panoramic vision for the attainment of universal peace. Let me just give one example. A highlight of Abdul-Bahá's visit to North America in 1912 was his participation at the 18th Lake Mohonk Peace Conference on International Arbitration, which was held from May 15 to the 17th. And we have a picture of Abdul-Baha and some of the people who attended that conference. And if we could see this picture, please. This is it. Abdul-Baha is the man with the white beard and the robes, and the other individuals who are gathered there were some American Baha'is and in addition to Abdul-Baha's interpreter and companions who accompanied him on his travel. This conference was an important conference. It was attended by about 180 prominent people from many different fields. There were judges, presidents of universities, people from the newspapers, diplomats, religious and labor leaders, politicians, prime ministers, and the like. And it's interesting to read the talk that Abdul-Baha presented at that conference, and it's included in one of the appendices of our book. The speech that he gave at the Lake Mohonk gathering focused on the significance of the historical moment and the uniqueness of the 20th century. Now, this is 1912. He's giving this speech. He refers briefly to the turmoil and the conflict that took place in the 19th century, not only in Europe, but also he gave the example of Persia, which was the country of his birth. And he notes that during this period of conflict, Baha'u'llah, the founder, the bringer of truth for this particular age, appeared. And he identifies Baha'u'llah's mission with bringing about the oneness of the human family and what he described as the greatest peace. And he connects this new message, if you will, with the means of attaining progress in the 20th century and beyond. He then, in the latter part of his talk, sets out a number of important principles that are critical to the attainment of universal peace. And he links the implementation of these principles with the elimination of prejudices that sustain war. But I give this example because it seems to me that it illustrates Abdul-Baha's broad approach, the way in which he broadened the context and elevated the discussion.
Thank you. With reference to the principles that Abdul-Baha illustrated, Professor Mahmoudi, could you further define the pattern for these principles within the context of also bringing in the historical milieu of the early 20th century in terms of the changes that were taking place in the arts, the sciences, architecture?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's so fascinating that the turn of the century, 1900, really beginning early on, was a time of such rapid social change in every facet of life. I mean, if anyone examines this, they'll be fascinated, because in some ways I would say what was happening then is a bit similar to what's happening today, and many thinkers of today are saying this as well. So in the early 1900s, for example, on the artistic scene, we have a bunch of artists in Europe in particular who are impressionists, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but they began to use bold colors and images, of people from other places and other islands in the world and all of that. And for the ordinary art connoisseur, this was a very difficult image to see. In fact, there was an art exhibit in London that really shocked the people who attended, and yet others viewed it as this moment of change, this significant moment of change. Architecture began to change. Music, classical music was undergoing major changes. Every invention imaginable, the newspapers, for example, became much more widely distributed. The postal service began to, deliver all sorts of things to people. Transportation, rails were being laid down and trains were taking people to various places. And even the introduction of the automobile was quite fascinating because people weren't used to it. They were used to horses and buggies. And so when they were walking, oftentimes, unfortunately, they would get hit by cars because they weren't used to the speed, even though it wasn't that the speed wasn't at what we might imagine it. It was very slow when the cars were invented. Anyway, I say all of this because it was truly a time of amazing change. And this is juxtaposed against these political empires that existed at the time, which in a sense, these were people, the kings and queens and their relatives, these were cousins and relatives, and there was a whole different world that was taking place within this empire. And yet there were people on the ground who were, locked into a system that had been there for centuries, in a sense. So this change that began in the early 1900s eventually really began to change so many aspects of life on this planet. And Abdul-Baha comes into this world fully aware of everything that is going on. I mean, you mentioned The Secret of Divine Civilization, which is a book that Abdul-Baha wrote anonymously so that people in Iran would read it because there was a bias against the Baha'is. He wrote it as a treatise regarding how Iran can modernize. Mind you, he wrote this book in 1875, but this was the time of modernity. And he wrote this book to give the Iranian people and leaders an idea about, first, the spiritual approach to modernity, and second, the material. And I want to just give you some of the features of that document. He calls for constitutional and democratic government, the rule of law, universal education, the protection of human rights, economic development, religious tolerance, the promotion of useful sciences and technologies, and programs of public welfare. So, here in 1875, he's written this book in which he outlines what a successful nation ought to be thinking about and what are the pathways that they should be engaged in. But then he goes to great lengths to say education alone is not enough. It's good to have skills and education and knowledge, but this whole program of modernity needs a spiritual framework. Meaning, if you lay down an economic system, it needs to be a just, fair system. The people at the bottom need to be treated just as fairly as the people at the top. That women should be a part of this process. That everyone should receive an education. That everyone should aspire to improve the arts and sciences and to build businesses. And in a sense, through this moral, spiritual, as well as material advance, that you begin to create a society that can meet the needs of all people. Because it isn't that we don't have enough resources to meet the needs of all people. It's how we distribute those resources that becomes problematic, which we see today, especially in our current crisis of the pandemic pandemic episode, which also shows the inequalities that exist through, I mean, it has really exposed those even more, although we were aware of them. So, you know, what Abdul-Baha does in the early 1900s, he says, okay, here is what's happening in the world, and it's not good because the empires are building armaments against each other. They're getting ready to go to war against each other. The people in Europe, many of them are being oppressed and held down. Many of them are really living under deplorable conditions. Poverty is rife. And he says, all of these problems emanate from the fact that there is no spiritual framework, that there is no emphasis on how we should treat each other justly. And also, how do leaders in particular come together and unify and come up with ideas as to how to take care of their citizens, how to deal with the problems that the majority of their citizens were experiencing at the time. So, you know, Abdul-Baha, the unique thing is that he was very much aware of what was happening in the world, but it wasn't just awareness. He had something to say about it, and he always did. And it was extremely helpful and beneficial because, and those of you who will read the book and read his letters, he outlines succinctly what needs to happen. I'll just end with this. For example, in the tablets to the Hague, he basically goes through every single barrier that there is in relation to why there isn't peace in the world. Economic barrier, political barrier, racial barrier, religious barrier. You know, he just outlines all of these and says that, you know, these cannot be solved just by material means. You need a spiritual moral framework.
As you began to mention the tablets of the Hague, one of the most fascinating aspects of the book was this notion of the 24-year-old young man who began this entire enterprise, if we will, of discussions with the Central Organization for Durable Peace in The Hague. Could you go into that? Because as I was reading the book, I hadn't ever thought of this as, you know, in some ways it began as an individual initiative by a youth. Dr. Khan, could you begin with that, please?
Sure. Well, to do that, I have to first of all tell you about this particular organization at The Hague, that led to the event that happened in Tehran. Okay, in the early part of the century, there were initiatives associated with organizations trying to organize the peace movement. And one of these particular initiatives took place at The Hague. And The Hague emerged really as an important center for peace activities. Two conferences that were held 8 years apart, one in 1899 and one in 1907 at The Hague. And these conferences were called by the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and which was really interesting in itself, that peace conferences would be called by a king, by the Tsar. And they were called with the objective of limiting armaments and military expenditure and promoting arbitration as a means of resolving conflicts. So there were some who were beginning to look for different ways of resolving conflicts, and one of these was arbitration. The ideas that came out of these two early peace conferences at The Hague were interesting ideas, but there was no real political will to put them into practice. So, you know, there were some good things, but basically they were not so effective. However, those who were involved with this peace process there they were convinced that there was value to the ideas that were being pursued, and they felt if they could be organized better, then maybe these Hague peace conferences would evolve into something that was long-term. And so they started planning for another conference in 1915. And in fact, when the war broke out in 1914, the First World War, some of the governments and parliaments in different countries were already making preparation for a third Hague Peace Conference, which they had tentatively scheduled for 1915. Well, the war interrupted all of this, but the Dutch peace societies, which were very active, they didn't want to let this drop. And so in collaboration with the Swiss, they took the initiative to create a body to coordinate peace activities on a temporary basis. So they got to have, it's better to have something that's temporary rather than not to have anything. And it was this temporary group that became the central organization for a durable peace. And this was the organization then that appointed an executive committee, that wrote a manifesto and a minimum program for peace and distributed it throughout the world with the aim of engaging widespread discussion on the subject of peace, especially on its peace program, with a view to formulating proposals about how to implement the ideas in the minimum program, with the idea that when the war would come to an end, it would be possible to hand these ideas to whatever body was engaged in negotiating the peace. Okay, so as fate would have it, one of in a newspaper in Tehran, there was a story published about the Central Organization for a Durable Peace, its manifesto and its peace program, and the fact that it was looking for ideas, encouraging people to submit ideas to the organization so that it would become part of this general process. The person to read this report, I mean, obviously other people did, but the one that we knew about was a 24-year-old young man by the name of Ahmad Yazdani. And I think we should put up his picture at this point. And so Kate, if you could put up Ahmad Yazdani's picture, please. Here he is, a young man. He was 24. He studied engineering. He was proficient in the French language, and also he knew Esperanto, the international language of Esperanto. He was obviously a wide-awake young man who was interested in what was happening in the world and what was necessary for the betterment of humankind. He understood what was going on, and he saw an opportunity to bring to the attention of this organization at The Hague some of the ideas of the Baha'i Faith. Okay, now in implementing his plan, he sought the assistance of two senior connected Baha'is. The first was an eminent scholar, Janabi Ibn Asdaq, who had a high rank he was a scholar and had a high rank in the Baha'i Faith, and a second man by the name of Colonel Ibrahim Piruzbach, who was a medical doctor and who had positions in the military. Both of these men were, if you will, worldly wise. They understood what was happening. They were familiar with world events. They'd traveled widely and had contact with prominent people in the upper echelons of society. So these three, on the initiative really of a 24-year-old, sat down and prepared a paper setting out a Baha'i perspective on peace. And also they translated various articles on the subject and forwarded it to the organization at The Hague, indicating that they might be interested in this, and if they wanted some more new ideas, then they were the group at The Hague was encouraged to communicate with Abdul-Baha. And by golly, it did. The organization at The Hague wrote to Abdul-Baha. The letter, because of the war and the blockades, naval blockades in Palestine at the time, the mail didn't get through. So the mail was redirected in care of the Iranian Baha'is, our group of three in Tehran. Abdul-Baha's letter was sent there. It was not just a one-shot letter back and forth, but it seems that this communication continued really over several years. When the war ended in 1918 and it was possible to communicate with Palestine, then all this information was sent to Abdul-Baha, who was living in Palestine. He was residing in Palestine at the time. And along with the materials, the group explained to Abdul-Baha what they'd been doing and what the reaction of the central organization had been. This was really one of the triggers that led Abdul-Baha to write the first of his letters to the organization at The Hague. In December of 1919, he wrote this very long letter which set out the framework for peace and what was required in order to be able to establish a peace that was durable, that was sustainable. And not only did he write a letter, did Abdul-Baha write the letter to The Hague, but he appointed Ibn Astar and Ahmad Yazdani, our 24-year-old youth, to serve as a delegation to travel on his behalf to the Netherlands in order to present his letter, Abdul-Baha's letter, to the organization at The Hague. And then things unfolded from there. The organization at The Hague responded in writing to Abdul-Baha's letter, and Abdul-Baha then wrote a second letter, which was delivered by the delegation as well. So in brief, that was a long story, but it's just delightful.
Professor Mahmoudi, can you carry this story along to this young man who is very modern, and there's the older gentleman who is a eminent personage in the faith, who traveled together from Palestine to The Hague, and with the tablets, how it was received, some of the anecdotes during their time there.
Yes, you know, as Janet was conveying the story, I'm always struck by this 24-year-old man, Mr. Yazdani, because, you know, 24 years old. And, you know, if you think about, I mean, I'm not trying to stereotype here, but youth has a tendency to be a little bit, you know, frenetic about things, and maybe to sort of jump towards doing certain things without really thinking it through. Please don't misunderstand. I was a 24-year-old too, so I understand. But I'm just saying there are those tendencies. But in this case, this young man decides, you know, yes, he wants to act. He wants to react. I mean, he obviously, from his own spiritual education, he has something to offer in this moment in history when he's read this ad in the paper. And what does he do? He takes action. Clearly, he reacts, you know, and it's through his actions, but he goes to some other people who may have some wisdom about how to approach this whole issue, and begins to discuss and consult with them about how they should proceed. And I think from that action of this young man, he was able to create a way to open the door, if you will, to then, I would say, bring about this incredible journey that ends up with these two very significant letters being delivered to this committee at The Hague. I mean, I think that's a really brilliant example of individual initiative that's couched with wisdom and thoughtfulness, and the ability to then communicate what it is that one knows, not only sincerely, but also astutely and with wisdom, so that it has an impact, so that it gets somewhere. It approaches people who are willing to listen, and even if the impact isn't as much as they would have liked it to be, which we'll talk about, these letters still live. They are still as pertinent today as they were 100 years ago. And, you know, programs like the Baha'i Chair are basing their vision on what's in those letters in terms of removing the barriers to war and trying to create a world of peace. So I think what is, for me, is so amazing is that how to seize the moment and how to do it with wisdom is extremely important. So that sometimes, even though youth tells us, go for it, don't worry about it, you know, it's going to be okay, one has to wait and go back and really think and reflect and say, what is the most effective way that I can become an instrument to make this event more successful? And I think this is what this young 24 Mr. Yazdani did. And Kate, if you would put up the picture of Mr. Ibn Asdaq. So, you know, here is an older gentleman, Ibn Asdaq, dressed in traditional Persian garb, a very, you know, a wonderful scholar, very much an erudite individual. And then there is, and Kate, let's go to Mr. Yazdani's picture. And then there's this young man, you know, who is in modern clothes. And so these two, you can imagine, are walking in the streets of the Netherlands in various cities. And in his own account, Mr. Yazdani says, and it's in the book, so I'm not going to give away all of it. You'll just have to read it. But he says, we were walking down the street and a lot of the citizens of this town in the Netherlands started to actually gather around us to look at us, because they just, you know, these two were so interesting, because here is this elderly man in his traditional clothes, and then here is young Yazdani in his, you know, his regular clothes of the day. but they were obviously not from the Netherlands, especially in the early 1900s. And so these people were quite taken aback, so much so that they circled around them, and apparently at some point a person of authority had to come and sort of break the crowd up, but so this was what the journey was like in the early 1900s. Although immigration and migration has always been around, but for these two gentlemen at that time to go to the Netherlands, this was not something that was often seen, especially in the smaller towns in the Netherlands and other places in Europe. So anyway, so I think, if I'm right, Vafa, you wanted me to say a little bit about the tablets as well?
Yes, if you don't mind. Particularly this concept that is so relevant today in all that is transpiring, the concept of Abdul-Baha that defines as unity of consciousness.
Yes, yes.
And the impact on resource management, inequalities.
Sure, definitely. So, and I'm going to just read it from the tablet so you can see what we're talking about in relation to conscience. And, conscience is a word that means to be able to distinguish good from wrong, right from wrong. But it also has a connotation of increasing one's consciousness, understanding, discernment about things. And so, at this moment when we're dealing with the pandemic, and then in this country, we're dealing with racism, it's a moment of conscience. In other words, all of us at this moment, including myself, are saying to ourselves, what is it that I should be doing? How should I be addressing this issue at this time? My neighbors are suffering. My friends are suffering. A lot of people are really upset about what is going on in this country, not only with the COVID-19, but with racism. So it's a moment of conscience. And what we do in moments like this with our actions becomes extremely important. So this is what Abdul-Baha addresses. He writes to the committee, he says, there is not one soul whose conscience does not testify that in this day there is no more important matter in the world than that of universal peace. So he says, yes, if you read the reality today, and we're back into the 1900s now, there's not a single person who would say that they are not for universal peace. But he says that's their conscience, and that's fine. But then he says, but the wise souls who are aware of the essential relationships emanating from the realities of things consider that one single matter, meaning universal peace, by itself, one single matter cannot by itself influence the human reality as it ought and should. For until the minds of men become united, no important matter can be accomplished. And then he says, at present, universal peace is a matter of great importance. You see, he doesn't let go of that. It's very important, universal peace. But unity of conscience, unity of right and wrong, unity of awareness is essential so that the foundation of this matter becomes secure, its establishment firm, and its edifice strong. So, I think this is so critical because right now, all of us are witnessing a moment in history. Just as back then, 100 years ago, with the World War I ensuing, they had a moment in history. And I think what stands out for me in relation to Abdul-Baha's bringing attention to the spirit of the age is this sense of urgency. Urgency that we need to find ways to unify our conscience with others in conversation. I don't mean that we go around and lecture to people, because that's not very effective. But how do we come together and converse and have conversations about how do we raise our awareness about these problems that show us how difficult it is to solve these problems unless there's some kind of unity of vision and unity of conscience. I think this point is so extremely important. And being at a university, I think one of the things that we like to drive home with the lectures that we have and the conversations that we have is this whole notion of, okay, we know that we have these problems in the world, but now let's see what the solutions might be. Let's look at what possibilities might be. And this is where, you know, the Baha'i Chair invites scholars from all kinds of disciplines to come and address these issues, because the hope is that little by little, through knowledge, which addresses social issues, which addresses the solutions, we will be able to raise consciousness. And hopefully there will be eventually a unity of conscience that is formed around that. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, yes. Dr. Khan, just as Professor Mahmoudi was mentioning this unity of conscience, and Abdul-Bahá in his framework for peace broadens it to define it as a collective state of being, as quote, manifesting unity, peace as manifesting unity. Could you help us understand that in terms of how is it characterized in the Baha'i vision for peace? How is this unique from, you know, just as not an end to warfare or statecraft?
Yes.
But this idea of manifesting unity.
Right, right. But as you say, the Baha'i conception of peace, it envisages not merely a peace that rules out armed conflict, but Abdul-Baha refers to the emergence of an age of peace that's characterized by this collective state of being, manifesting unity. And to me, this notion of it being an age of peace that's characterized by this collective state of being, manifesting unity, suggests a long-term vision for peace. It's something, as Hoda was saying, something to be built, something to be constructed, something that requires requires us to look at the assumptions that we have about many things that we take for granted, reassessing our assumptions, looking at our values, and because it'll be through developing this unity of conscience, this understanding of what's important to the creation of peace, that will lead us to find ways to implement the guidance, the teachings. In the second tablet to the Hague, Abdul-Baha really focuses in on what's described as the power of implementation. It's one thing to have agreement on the ideas, but it takes more than just knowing something. We have to act. And I think another aspect of unity of conscience is a deepening of our understanding of the importance of a certain principle or a certain action that becomes so strong that we want to act on it. In the second tablet to Abdul-Baha makes the point that the desire for peace can't be derived merely from the intellect. It's more than just knowing that this is what it should be. but you have to act. And for Baha'is, he makes the point that it's a matter of religious belief. It becomes a matter of conviction that we act on these principles that remove the barriers to peace. And we do it in a conscious way. We do it in a way that engages other people who are also looking for answers to how to bring about a sustainable peace. And I think it comes, in a sense, from spiritual insights, which give rise to, if you will, a moral imperative, the feeling that we have to act on this insight because it is so important and so beneficial to the state of the world. So, small steps, there'll be many challenges. It's not easy, but peace begins with the individual. And from there, it spreads to family, to community, to nations. And I think our understanding of what this phrase, a collective state of being manifesting unity, will evolve and grow as we have more experience trying to put it into practice. We'll learn from experience.
Vafa, may I also add something?
Please.
You know, I think, again, picking up on what Janet was saying, you know, and I'm going to go back to Abdul-Baha and his approach to the world. You know, he wasn't interested in converting people to his way of thinking or to these principles. That was not the point of his, you know, at the end of his life, when he's been in exile and a political prisoner and this and that for most of his life, to pick up and come to the West was not an easy matter, okay? And so the issue was not about whether people believe in a religion or not. Maybe they don't even believe in a God. It didn't matter to him. The point was, what should be the role of religion in society? Because religion, as I mentioned earlier, is one of religious strife, is one of the barriers to peace. And so he was, in a sense, defining what should the role of religion be, reminding us again about the role of religion in society. And I think what was important about what he had to say about that is that, look, it doesn't matter whether you have a religion or not, but how should we behave towards one another as human beings? Do we want to be warring and people who separate each other from each other and compete with one another and you know, create disunity and create all kinds of hardships and difficulties, or are we meant for greater things? Again, from a moral framework, a spiritual framework, how do we come together and have mature conversations about how to put away our differences to realize that we're just human beings? We are just human beings, but together in unity, we can accomplish so much more than if we just come together and start competing and warring with each other. I think this was so important about his example, is that, you know, he saw in the teachings of his father's religion, the Baha'i Faith, very practical spiritual possibilities for the world to approach peace. And what he did, and he describes this in another one of his letters, it has to do with, he refers to them as candles of unity. And he says, you know, we have to strive for greater unity in different realms. The unity of the people in the world, the people, you know, unity among the peoples of the world. unity among the nations of the world, unity in the political realm, unity in the economic realm, and on and on and on. Enlarge, in this way, he enlarges the circle of unity. That is the vision, actually, that the Baha'i faith has about peace, which is we have to learn to to enlarge these circles of unity. And if we think about it, we've already achieved the one about the unity of humankind, meaning the unity of people, in that people in this world are now aware of each other. They know that when something happens, I would just use the example of George Floyd in the US. An African-American man is pulled over by a police officer, and what happens? And the next thing you know, within less than 24 hours, it is all over the world, these images. There's a unity, okay, that has occurred among the peoples of the world. Likewise, we have to keep building this unity of conscience to enlarge in the other unities. And some of them are only going to come about if the leaders of the world come together and try to unify in the way they lead the world. And others of them is up to every single individual to find ways to create that unity.
Professor Mahmoudi, I'm very cognizant of time. It has really flown by, and we want to leave some time for questions at the end.
Sure.
Before we get to the questions, could you briefly describe the role of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace in terms of the academic discourses and contributions to peace?
Sure. The Baha'i Chair was established, and a chair at a university is a very prestigious thing. It carries a unique role. And the unique role of this chair is to really bring into the discourse in an academic setting the Baha'i vision for peace, which is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, how do we get rid of the barriers that impede society from achieving peace? It's not just about removing armaments and getting rid of the military weapons and all that. That's not going to bring us peace. It has to do with how human beings treat each other and our human nature. Will we struggle and strive to become more cooperative and agreeable with one another, or will we continue to go to our lower base, which is to compete and to be warlike, etc., etc. So the Baha'i Chair, it draws on different disciplines, interdisciplinary in its nature, and in inviting scholars who are doing some great research and have some amazing understanding about the very principles that these Baha'i writings talk about. As I said, what is the role of women in peace? What should the leaders be doing today in relation to peace? Baha'i writings have a lot to say about this, but how do scholars really, in their good research, enlighten us about how to remove these barriers, and what knowledge can we gain from them about what measures should be taken in order to improve in all these facets the impediments, to get rid of the impediments to peace. So what the Baha'i Chair does is, through its program, which, by the way, all of these lectures are on our YouTube channel, you can go and listen to them. When these speakers talk about whatever topic, they actually help us understand more practically how we should approach this problem, and they enlighten what it is that we need to do. In other words, what actions can we take in order to inform policy, in order to change my own thinking, in order to broaden the minds of all of us as to how these problems can be solved. So it's a very interesting, I think, program that engages in discourse within an academic setting with the goal of trying to find solutions, trying to find ways to solve problems. And I would say that there are so many, many thoughtful academics so many who are doing amazing work, and that we need to really tap into that knowledge system and learn from it, and then see what we can do in order to promote some of the solutions. So, you know, we are very much active in the University of Maryland academic community. We have students who are very much engaged with us. We teach courses, and we have all these programs that go on all year long. And if people are interested, they can certainly go to our website. We have an amazing lineup of speakers for our fall semester that'll start in late August, early September. And anyone can be a part of this process. It's not closed to just, you know, these are open arenas. People, all of our lectures are live streamed. People just need to sign up. And so it's an open program that goes beyond the campus community. And in this way, the chair continues to advance knowledge about how to bring about world peace, and to bring, hopefully, bring about unity of conscience about how to do that.
Thank you. Dr. Seaman, if you don't mind joining us, if there's questions that have already come, I see one in the chat group regarding the YouTube channel and how people can access information regarding the chair, as well as, I believe they mentioned, how can they access the YouTube channel? But besides that, are there are questions that have come in?
I don't have any yet, but let me just, everybody can use the chat box to send the questions through. So if you have questions, pop them in the chat box and I will see them, and then I can read them out.
So Kate, let me start on the YouTube channel, Kate, and you can please chime in and help me out with that, okay? So if you go to our website, just Google the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, go to the website, and if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see, you know, there's a YouTube icon down there, and you click on that. Then when you go to that next screen, you have to be willing to search a little bit. So you have to look for all the different topics and different speakers that are provided in that in the YouTube channel. And Kate, might you talk about how we've organized those and what they do to access those?
Yeah, so I've just posted the link in the chat that goes to the YouTube channel, and then all of the talks are organized in our themes. So you can search by a specific theme if you would like to. We also have lists for all of the conferences where they're all posted as well. The other place you can check is on the Baha'i Chair website under the videos tab, and that's where they're all available there as well. And somebody had also asked how you sign up to attend the lectures. The easiest way to do that is to go to our events page. I'll pop that in the chat now, and then you can register for each event on there as well.
So they should check their chat box to see these the links.
Yes. Sorry, I'm going to mute myself while I type.
As we wait, if questions come in, you know, one of the fascinating, Dr. Khan and Professor Matou, both of you mentioned, I made a reference to this, but in terms of the power of implementation, one of the fascinating quotes that was referenced in the book by Abdul-Baha is the concept, is the phrasing of small steps, if they are regular and rapid, add up to a great distance traveled. And the implications of that in terms of how we you know, grow towards further unity, how we develop peace in all of its manifestations. As questions are coming in, perhaps you could address, you give your thoughts on that topic.
You know, I want to be sure that that quote is acknowledged as belonging to a letter written by the Universal House of Justice, the international governing body of the Baha'is. It's in a letter that they wrote, I believe it was January 18, you might all help me out here, 2019. and the letter is about peace, actually. And so, you know, they say how, you know, the little steps. It takes little steps. And I think the point is, it's sort of like Yazdani, if we can go back to the 24-year-old youth. He could have just taken huge steps and run to the Netherlands to do what he needed to do, right? But he didn't. He really took small steps initially. And his small steps ended up creating something that is still living and very much a part of the vision of what we'd like to see the world achieve. So I think it's a good lesson to all of us that, you know, heroic acts are not necessarily the best way to achieve things. It's really more about how do we build a foundation? How do we strengthen a foundation that is based on our ethical beliefs, on our moral considerations towards each other, and how that then radiates out to larger and larger initiatives. But it starts small, and we have to stay with that process. I think that's one of the hardest things to do, but to stay with that process really means that it's a process. It's ever evolving and moving towards the goal, rather than being frenetic, jumping from one thing to another and wasting energy. Even if you're on that process and sometimes you don't feel like you're being heard, you just have to stay on that process until it happens.
So we have questions coming in now. Sorry, Janet, did you want to? So the first question is whether you could both share your thoughts on the role of women in creating a world without wars and raising the consciousness of humanity.
Janet, why don't you go ahead? I've been talking a lot. And I'll say something about it, of course.
I haven't gone to sleep, I'm thinking. I think the role of women is something that in peace, well, if you think about the role of women, Abdul-Baha has said that the advancement of women is a prerequisite for peace. So the development of women and women's involvement is critical to the achievement of peace. Unless women are invited to participate in all the processes associated with peace, unless we act to develop our capacities and to seek the opportunities for education and the like that come to us so that we can make for ourselves, it won't be possible to create the psychological climate which will allow real peace to develop. So the role of women in relation to peace, I think, is to develop one's own capacity, to seek education, to seek opportunities to engage in the life of society, to give special attention to the education of sons and daughters, so that there are attitudes of equality and acceptance within the family. And I think, Hoda, you probably have something to say now.
No, I think this is an extremely important principle. I think, you know, survey the world right now. Who are the ones that are at the forefront of this pandemic in service to humanity? It is mostly women. Now, how can I make that statement? Okay, not only are they a large part of the caregivers, but they are a large part of the service industry. They at home have now doubled their shifts because oftentimes women may not be in homes. They may be single mothers, but even if they're homes where they're married, or whatever the arrangement, they end up having to deal with most of the services that are rendered to others, whether it's their elderly folks that they have to take care of, whether it's children they have to attend to. In other words, women right now are, if you will, holding up the world. And I'm not suggesting there aren't men in these industries, service industries, et cetera, but really there is a larger proportion of women engaged at this point. The problem with the lack of equality between women and men is that when you limit the capacity of half of humanity, you have limited the capacity of the entire humanity. Everyone cannot achieve their full capacity unless everyone is given equal opportunity to achieve their full capacity. Now, I'm going to use a term that has often been viewed as a negative term, which is feminism, or being a feminist. If you look up the word feminist in the dictionary, it simply means a person who believes in the equality of women and men. I think in order to bring about the full equality of women, we need more men who are feminists. We need to have this battle taken up more by the men than for women to constantly struggle for their rights. In a sense, it has to do with those in power. There's a system that has been with us for centuries called patriotism. Called patriarchy, that has said that women really are second class and they should be ruled. And it's this system that until it disappears, quite frankly, until it totally disappears, we cannot have full equality between women and men. And women cannot be the only ones that are out there trying to say, we want our rights. And by rights, I don't mean just equal pay and laws. You can pass all the laws you want, and we have in many countries. We still have violence against women. We still have discrepancies with their income. We still have all kinds of barriers, okay? So it's a very, very large problem that can't just be solved by saying, well, we just need to find ways to increase our awareness. It really requires action. It requires our removing these very subtle stereotypes that we have, that little girls cannot do this, and only boys can do that. And then furthermore, I just want to end by saying this, that women, it's true that we bear the children for those who might want to have children, and it's true that we have to be responsible when we have children. It's a huge moral responsibility. But that doesn't mean that forever we are prisoners of the home. We have to be, as Abdul-Baha said, in every arena, in every part of this world. Women have to be in it equally, with a voice and with authority. And that's not going to happen if women just put emphasis on, and I'm not putting down these important roles, motherhood and being at home, I'm not putting it down, but they have got to find ways to come out into the world and contribute to building a new world, a more hopeful world, which we're all hoping for. So it's a huge, huge problem, but it requires enormous effort. And I would say the men need to really lead the way.
I think that leads nicely into our next question, which is about the role of the media in the process of achieving peace. raising consciousness and understanding. So considering the role the media has as one of the powerful, if not the most powerful and impactful entity, what is the role of the media in this process in your view? And are there examples you can think of where the media has been successful in contributing positively?
I'll get started, and then Janet, please join in. You know, this is a very difficult question, especially today, especially since this internet has gone wild. I'm quite disturbed these days because I read about all the conspiracy theories that are being promoted on the internet. I'm very concerned about the vaccination movement right now. And so many other things, the hatred that is being promoted by media, and the fact that the media has also become so polarized, like the rest of the world. You know, it's become so polarized. I mean, it practically takes reading 10 different sites before one can perhaps arrive at some semblance of truth about a certain story. And unless people are savvy to fact check everything and to rely on more reliable sources, all of us are vulnerable and can begin to fall into believing some of the false news that is out there. And so I think it's extremely important for us to, what I want to say is we need to be very careful about the opinions we hold and the assumptions that we might make about the news today. Because even the once considered best newspapers now have other motives behind why they publish the things they do. And this is why one really has to read far and wide. And I think that the important thing is to use one's rational mind to say, you know, let me just, this vaccination thing that I talked about, you know, before the pandemic, we were concerned about people, and especially young children who suffer from cancer and other, you know, other problems, that if they're exposed to other children who may have not been vaccinated, you know, and have, you know, carry some kind of a disease, the risk of that, you know, and now with the pandemic, we don't know how many people will actually reject taking the scientific measures into consideration and doing what is necessary, even beyond vaccinations. I mean, masks have now become a political statement. You know, it's amazing. So media really can destroy human lives, as we see right now. And I think we all have to be extremely careful to not fall for conspiracy theories because they are simple. They explain things very simply, and we are not willing sometimes to really search for the truth.
So I'm conscious that we are close to running out of time. So maybe Janet, if you want to add to that, and then I have one last quick question, and then maybe we can wrap up.
I just want to make a quick comment about the media. I think that one of the things that this present situation with the COVID-19 is confronting us all with is that there's a need to take a close look at assumptions that we have about many things, about many social institutions, about what kind of a world we'd really like to see as things wind down in the future. And I think for me, the media is one of these institutions or systems that really would benefit from a close examination of what is its purpose, has it diverted from its purpose, because clearly all it does at the moment is sort of polarize things and take everything to extremes. But it could have a role in helping to identify the reality of situations. If the media was conducted in such a way that it exposed different points of view and the like, with a view to finding the truth of a situation.
Okay, so one quick question we had is the name of the book with the stories about the young Ahmad Yazdani. Could you provide the name of the book?
Oh, the book. Yes, the book. Here's the book. It's called A World Without War. Oh, you mean the book that Mr. Yazdani has? Yes. That's in the reference section of the book. And Janet, are you finding it? Yeah, Janet, we can't.
Hang on. Yeah, translated into English, the title translates as The Account of the Revelation of the Peace Tablet to the Hague. That's one. And then there's one by Shohangiz Yazdani Javid, which is called Ahmad Yazdani, the messenger of Abdul-Bahá's teachings of peace to the Hague, Holland. And that also is translated from the Persian.
So these are both in Persian language, and we had them, in a sense, interpreted for us so that we could include it in the book. But they are in the reference section of the book as well. And I might add, there are some relatives of the Yazdanis online today. So, and one of the ones that really helped us out, Janet, you may want to introduce her.
Yes, my friend, Dr. Nushin Fati, who helped with some of the translation of Ahmad Yazdani's material. And we're really grateful to Nushin. Thank you.
The volume written by Professor Mahmoudi and Dr. Khan is now available on Amazon and iTunes. If you can just put up that screen, if you don't mind. Okay, yeah.
I've also shared the links in the chat box as well.
Wonderful.
And with that, I'd like to thank not only the chair for organizing this event, but also Professor Mahmoudi and Dr. Khan for taking time in very different time zones, one early morning and one getting late at night, for being with us today and discussing this fascinating volume. Thank you very much.